The Empress Matilda has been chased out of London by other people. Her fortunes have flipped. She came so close to being crowned as ruler of England, only to lose out at the last hurdle. Now on the retreat to Oxford, her new ally, Bishop Henry of Winchester, turns on her and joins his brother's side again, despite King Stephen being a prisoner of the Empress. King Stephen's wife, Queen Matilda, is marching towards London with an army, and upon reaching London, Queen Matilda's forces begin to pillage the area. The deeds of King Stephen records that Queen Matilda gave orders that they should rage most furiously around the city with plunder and arson, violence and the sword, in sight of the Countess and her men. The people of London were in grievous trouble. On the one hand, their land was being stripped before their eyes, and reduced by the enemy's ravages to a habitation for the hedgehog, and there was no one ready to help them. On the other hand, that new lady of theirs was going beyond the bounds of moderation and sorely oppressing them. Therefore, they judged it worthy of consideration to make a new pact and peace and alliance with the Queen and join together with one mind to rescue their king and lord from his chains. The Queen was demonstrating to the Londoners what would happen if they did not comply, despite running Empress Matilda out of London. The king was still a prisoner, so Queen Matilda made the point of showcasing her strength to sway the people of London that their task was not completed until the king was freed. Empress Matilda's position of strength was fading. Her new allies began to desert her and join with Queen Matilda. Geoffrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, switched loyalties back to the king. Despite the Empress granting him new lands and titles, he joined forces with Queen Matilda as she arrived in London. Bishop Henry, the king's brother, had left Empress Matilda after a disagreement and headed to Winchester. Queen Matilda appealed to the bishop for aid. The deeds of King Stephen states Bishop Henry agreed to Queen Matilda's appeal, as she, by the woman's tearful supplication, which she pressed on him with great earnestness. Bishop Henry switched sides again and issued a proclamation from Winchester that he supported the king again and that all English nobles should follow his lead. Quite a flip, as only 2 months ago he proclaimed Empress Matilda as Lady of the English, and argued that the kingdom would fall into decay if the bishops didn't support the Empress. Bishop Henry also had the audacious desire to write to one of Empress Matilda's biggest supporters, Brian Fitz-Count, who was one of the first men to swear his loyalty to the Empress. Bishop Henry tells Brian that if he did not return to his brother's side, he would be numbered among the most unfaithful men of England. The hypocrisy from Bishop Henry is strong here, so much so that Brian wrote a reply addressing Bishop Henry as a hypocrite and that he had always served the correct monarch, even through his own personal hardships. He finishes his letter by stating that he was ready to prove himself against Bishop Henry through combat or by a court process. An incredibly bold statement to challenge a high-ranking member of the church to combat. Brian was certainly going all in on his support for the Empress. Empress Matilda made her way back to her base in Oxford, along with her half-brother Earl Robert of Gloucester. After the disaster of London, they needed to come up with a plan to move forward. They still had King Stephen locked up in Bristol Castle, but they would have to deal with the army under Queen Matilda and William of Ypres. Taking London would have to wait, as one of Winchester's castles was under siege from Bishop Henry. Winchester at this time in history had 2 castles, the Royal Castle, which Empress Matilda owned, and Wolvesey Castle, which belonged to Bishop Henry. Both castles were reinforced, making a siege long and difficult. Before the siege, Empress Matilda had sent Robert to negotiate with Bishop Henry, but that achieved nothing. Now, Empress Matilda rallied her forces and marched towards Winchester. On the journey towards Winchester, Empress Matilda sent a letter to Bishop Henry asking him to meet her in person to explain himself. She must have been curious why a man who promised to aid her and granted her lavish titles would now turn on her in a mere 2 months. His reply was a cryptic "prepare himself." He then fled his castle, leaving a garrison behind, and asked for aid from Queen Matilda. On the 31st of July 1141, Empress Matilda's army arrived at the gates and was able to enter the city unopposed. From there they fought off the small garrison force besieging Empress Matilda's castle, before moving on to Wolsey Castle. The size of Empress Matilda's force is debatable, as two of our sources state different numbers, as well as the amount of nobles present in Empress Matilda's war party. While the siege was ongoing, Empress Matilda settled in the royal castle and conducted her battle plan from there, receiving advice from Robert and King David of Scotland, and making plans on how to take Wolsey Castle. Yet, on the 2nd of August, the garrison of Wolsey Castle started throwing out flammable material in order to cause chaos and confusion. And, as it was the height of summer, the city quickly caught fire as there were plenty of wooden buildings. John of Worcester tells us that Bishop Henry, goaded by rage and to strike terror and dismay into the hearts of people, he determined to set fire to the city and burn it to the ground. The fire consumed the people's homes and destroyed provisions in the city. The smoke must have been awful for the Empress's soldiers and the people of Winchester, who had just lost their homes. With Winchester burning, a new threat arrived. Queen Matilda was approaching with an army which consisted of militia from London, heavy infantry, and a variety of mercenaries. Empress Matilda was now trapped as the Queen's army surrounded the city and occupied the roads, cutting off supplies to the Angevins. A double siege was now in effect. The Queen also had with her several lords and earls, William de Warenne, Simon de Celis, Gilbert de Clare, and Geoffrey de Mandeville. Empress Matilda was now in a desperate situation. Her army was running out of food, there wasn't much shelter for her troops and the people of Winchester to rest after the fire burnt most of the buildings down. Time was not on her side. The longer her army stayed in Winchester, the weaker her forces would get, whereas Queen Matilda's forces were being supplied from London, so they could wait and have an easy victory. Queen Matilda's forces soon started assaulting the Angevin outposts. One outpost near Wherwell Abbey was attacked by William of Ypres, and the garrison driven off into the abbey for protection. The royal forces then began to throw torches to set fire to the abbey, which quickly set ablaze, forcing the Angevin troops inside to surrender, along with a group of nuns fleeing the destruction. The only person to refuse to surrender was John Fitzgilbert, but as the flames spread, the lead roof collapsed, crushing him, while the hot lead blinded him in one eye. Yet somehow he escaped. With the outpost fallen and no progress being made on the siege of Wolsey Castle, the only option remained was to try and break free and head towards Devizes Castle. As each day passed, the only actions were skirmishes in the street and supplies dwindling each day. By September, the situation was dire, so the Angevins began to pack up their baggage train and made a plan to escape. The most important aspect of this plan was keeping Empress Matilda safe. On the 14th of September 1141, the Angevins set their escape plan into motion. The deeds of King Stephen tells us that everything was going according to plan. As a precaution for the withdrawal, they were in close column, all retreating as one body. To secure the safety of the Empress, she was placed at the front of the column, while Robert commanded the rearguard. But, as soon as they began to leave the city, they came under attack as Queen Matilda's forces, commanded by William of Ypres, assaulted from all sides. The tenacity of the attack made by the Queen's troops quickly broke down any order in the Angevin retreat. Robert kept order in the rearguard and fought back while moving 8 miles west towards Stockbridge, where the Angevins had to cross a ford in the River Tess, while being pursued by an ever-increasing number of royal troops. Crossing this ford would take time, as only a certain number of troops could cross at one time. So, Empress Matilda and her bodyguards crossed first, while Robert continued to hold the line. King David of Scotland was also with Empress Matilda, crossing with her. King David would be captured 3 times, but each time he miraculously escaped. After crossing the ford, Empress Matilda and her bodyguards rode as quick as they could towards Devizes Castle, 40 miles away. She rode in the male horse riding fashion, as the ladies of this time rode side saddle. Back at the River Tess, most of the Angevin forces had scattered. Only Robert's rearguard troops were still fighting in order to buy more time for the rest to escape. But soon Robert and his men were surrounded by the Queen's more numerous force. Robert knew that crossing the ford with the enemy so pressed against him would lead to disaster, so he fought to a last stand. Thanks to his position as one of the leading commanders in the Angevin cause, he was captured instead of killed in the field. Yet some knights were not as lucky, as a few had thrown off their armour in order to escape. The deeds of King Stephen writes about the fate of those fleeing. What am I to say about the knights, nay, the greatest barons, who cast away all emblems of their knighthood, and going on foot in sorry plight, gave false names and denied they were fugitives? Some fell into the hands of peasants and were most terribly beaten. Some concealed themselves in sordid hiding places, white and full of dread, and lurked there until they either had a chance to escape, or were found at last by their enemies and dragged out in shameful and unseemly fashion. The Rout of Winchester was a disaster for the Angevins.